Welcome back to LizCapism. In October, when we had our first big snow, I started to wonder about winter wear from historical fashion. I had seen bits and pieces here and there, but not much on the whole. I realized I didn't really have an idea about winter preparation throughout history. So I put on my research hat and got down to work. I didn't have an era in mind, so I tried a few different kinds of searches. The first was to try and find historical equivalents of modern winter wear. What do I wear when I go out in the cold? The second was to flip through a stack of old catalogs I have, which date between the 1890s and the 1950s. What was advertised for winter wear back then? I ended up with a list of about 30 items. Some were similar from different time periods. Women have been making underclothing out of warm materials for centuries, and cloaks were always a popular outerwear choice, but others were particular to a certain age or style. I narrowed it down to what I thought would be a manageable list and made some plans. If you were raised in the Canadian prairies, you learn about winter living the same way you learn a language or how to walk. Someone must have taught you. You got it from somewhere, but damned if you can remember where or from whom. It's as natural as gravity, a knack. When asked how you know, you can't answer, you just know. So narrowing down the list was a matter of intuition. I didn't want to make winter wear that wasn't actually going to keep me warm, and I wanted winter wear that was at least somewhat practical. I also wanted these items to complement my existing wardrobe, indoors or outdoors. Another challenge is that I am doing my utmost to sew from my stash wherever possible. Once I had my list, which was narrowed down to 10 items, they divided neatly in two, which the history nerd in me immediately categorized as early modern winter and late modern winter. Despite the somewhat Eurocentric great history naming convention of these two categories, we're going to stick with them for the present because I think they're hilarious. Let's do a little historical background while I sew each of these items. Hose, later supplanted by things like stockings, socks, pantyhose, and now athleisure wear, was a leg covering which could take us through most of the history of people living in coldish climes. After watching Bernadette, Morgan, and Abby try their hands at medieval hose in the past few years, I feel like I don't have to tell you where you can find sources for drafting or patterning, or that this is a fiddly bit of sewing. My main sources for information were an excellent article from Alison Cannon on Foundations Revealed, as well as some tidbits from the Herjolfsnes excavation book Woven into the Earth. Hose for women usually only covered to just above the knee, and men's hose to the upper thigh. This is because men's clothing was shorter at the time. Men's hose could be tucked in or laced into undergarments. Women's hose was tied only with a garter just below the knee. It's worth noting that hose was not just a winter wear item, they were worn all the livelong year. For the purposes of keeping warm, though, I opted for the longer men's version, because regardless of the length of your skirt, the cold will get to your upper thighs and make no mistake. Hose from this time period, and most of the history of hose, would have been cut on the bias of a woven fabric, mostly wool. Unlike most garments of the time, the tight fit that was provided by the additional stretch of bias-cut material was essential for continued mobility. Cutting on the bias creates a lot of fabric waste, so it can be assumed that the stretch factor, as well as the garment itself, were very important. After a test run with a scrap piece of very loud, not camera-friendly jersey, I went on to work with my fashion fabric. While I did have woven fabric that I could technically cut on the bias, I too have concerns about fabric waste. I also live in an age of machine-knit textiles. So instead of cutting precious fabric on the bias, I utilized an old jersey cotton sheet. The bonus of this particular textile is that along with the stretch, it has been washed hundreds of times while it was still a bedsheet, therefore I don't have to worry about it shrinking. Even with pattern adjustments after 2 mock-ups, I still had to do some adjusting on the final pieces. They are by no means perfect, but gosh, they're comfy. I wore them for a test walk with the dog one night and felt very cozy indeed. The hood is seemingly even older than hose, and developed concurrently in many different cultures and regions. This is hardly surprising when you think that it's just a step away from draping a cloth over your head to keep warm. The general shape of the hood hasn't changed much in the last 1,000 years, nor has its general use. Strangely enough, the broadness of the history of the hood has made it really difficult to talk about, since so much history can't be summarized very quickly. So once again, let's narrow down our focus. When I made my Herjolfsnes dress back in the summer, I made a little cap to match the dress, but didn't make any of the hood patterns. But there are several patterns for hoods in the Medieval Garments Revealed book. The Herjolfsnes hoods are consistent with other contemporary styles despite the population's geographic distance from mainland Europe. So I felt safe in referring to this style as a medieval European hood, rather than just a Norse or Herjolfsnes hood. Rather than draft the pattern in the usual way by plotting it onto graph paper by referencing the book, I scanned the pattern from the book directly and printed it at 500%. The pattern that I chose from the book was the pattern with the largest shoulder covering. Creating a seal between your head and the rest of your outerwear is crucial in the winter. Plus, any opportunity to be extra, right? A bonus on medieval hoods is that they don't drape down to your neck, they tuck conveniently under the chin for full neck coziness. I had been under the impression that damask was newer than the 15th century, but I was wrong. This damask is no doubt machine woven with an automated jacquard loom, and the pattern seems to be a little bit more contemporary, but hey, historically adequate, right? I chose to line it, despite the originals not being lined, because I'm a tiny lady facing Canadian winters, and because the originals were made from wool twill, which doesn't really need to be lined. The assembly is pretty straightforward, as it's only a few pieces. I decided to reduce the bulk of the liripipe by excluding it from the lining piece. Then I bagged out the lining. I almost always end up with a saggy, warped mess when I bag out garment linings. But since this garment was meant to be worn over top of or underneath a heavy winter cloak, it will look wonky regardless, so I didn't fuss too much. And voila! And we move right along to the cloak. So we come crashing from the late medieval period smack dab into the 18th century. We've also moved continents to the freezing winters of New England. While cloaks like hoods and hose have been around for a long time, a specific cloak has always caught my eye. If you've been around historical costuming for any more than 10 seconds, you probably recognize this book, which means you probably recognize the cover photo. That cloak, my dears, has been on my dream costume list for a long time. The combination of the little cape, the swoosh, the collar, it's so fab. The authors, when discussing this particular cloak, suggest that, based on primary sources, it's possible that this style of cloak would have been seen as being a little bit much, a little bit too fancy. But for all it seeming very extra in style, it was very simple in construction. The cloak body was 2 pieces sewn down the center back, there was no lining, the 2 upper collar pieces were not sewn together, and all of the edges of the garment were left raw. In the interest of stash shopping, I opted for a poly-wool blend in my stash, rather than purchase the enormous yardage required for a cloak of this size. This size of fabric also meant a trip to the floor, which, as we all know, is Rosie's domain. She is committed to assisting me in this process.
I was gone for 2 minutes. What is this? What do you have to say for yourself, madam?
Mommy's hobby is confusing. What's the Rosie's face? What is Mom doing on the floor? Oh no, but... The lining was cut from the same black cotton flannel as the hood. I somehow wound up with 13 yards of this stuff, 60 inches wide, and I am putting it to good use. I didn't have enough fashion fabric to make the collar and the cape as well, so I opted to cut the cape piece out of some leftover poly stuff from my robe à l'anglaise mock-up. I lined it with linen, and then used that same poly to make the underside of the collar piece. I pretty much recreated the pattern's size exactly as it was from the original, which meant that it fit me pretty well, except being decidedly too long. I believe I shortened it a bit when I copied out the pattern, but after making it, it was still too long, so I busted out my hemming tool again and went to work evening it out. I learned how to use my new, used overlocker for this project, as I had no interest in hand finishing the entire hem, which would have taken me about 400 years. After overlocking, I whipped down the overlocked edge one night in bed while watching movies. All it needed now was a good press and a good swish. The mitts were something I had had my eye on from the American Duchess book, as they are part of the English gown chapter. I didn't complete them at the time due to a combination of lack of time and the fact that it was August, but I thought they would be an excellent match for my cloak, and I still had some wool from my gown left over. There's also a pair of gloves in the Costume Close-Up book. These are obviously the kind of accessories to keep your arms warm while your fingers still need dexterity. Not wholly practical for a long walk in the Canadian winter, but in general, the need for dexterous fingers is as alive as it ever was, and I feel like these would fit nicely over a thin pair of short finger gloves. When drafting my pattern, I opted to bring the lining back. Instead of the cotton flannel, which I felt would be too bulky, I chose instead to use more of the cotton jersey. These gloves were fiddly. The construction is pretty simple, but because you're dealing with a tight fit and so little fabric to begin with, you're operating within a very small margin of error. I used a scrap of silk taffeta to finish the top edges, and made it call back to the decorative embroidery with a decorative machine stitch around the thumb hole to reinforce it. November 30th, 1662. This day, I did first wear a muff, being my wife's last year's muff, and now I have bought her a new one. This serves me very well. Samuel Pepys. Muffs, being most commonly connected to women's fashion, were also used by men as winter wear. They comprise a double-layered cylinder stuffed between the layers with down or wool batting. Outside layer is usually fur, but sometimes a quilted silk, and the inner layer could be any manner of fabric from silk taffeta to wool or linen. Frankly, it doesn't seem practical as a cold weather accessory until you've been waiting at the bus stop for half an hour because your bus is late and your pockets are full because despite it being 2020, women's coats still only have tiny pockets, or unlined pockets which don't keep your hands warm at all. Even with gloves on in -30, your hands will start to hurt after about 10 minutes. Having a muff is something I have actively wished for while out of doors in my life. Frankly, there isn't much need for a pattern with a muff, as it's just a cylinder. You make those with 2 rectangles to your preferred size. But just in case there was something I was missing, I kept the American Duchess book handy for reference. Okay, now we have come to a slightly controversial part of the video. I used real fur to make the muff. Now before you start screaming at me in the comments, let's break down this choice on my part. I am a vegetarian, an animal rights activist, and an environmentalist. That being said, I am not inherently against the use of animal fur or hide in clothing. What I stand against are the costs to humans, animals, and the environment, which are a result of the leather, fur, and meat industrial complex. Those systems of mass production and highly wasteful manufacturing are at the heart of my objections to the purchase and use of animal products today. It has not been that long since the development of synthetic fabrics came even close to replicating the effectiveness of wool and fur to combat the temperatures that are common in Canadian winters. And those synthetic fibers also come at an environmental cost. There are many extant fur coats from previous generations because, guess what? Those things were made to last. Many of my family members have winter coats which they purchased in their 20s and wore well into their 70s and 80s. To that end, the pelts that I used were sourced from a fur stole which was given to my mother during a friend's clear-out, and it being too small and her not having need of it, she passed it on to me. Every single scrap of the pelts that did not end up on the outside layer of the muff ended up comprising a part of the inner stuffing. Not a single inch of the fur or hide was thrown away. I completely understand the aversion to wearing animal fur or leather. My choice was based on available materials and an examination of my personal values. You may have made a different choice. Had I not had an antique fur stole available to me, it's likely that I would have used some other stash fabric, rather than buy either real or faux fur new. All of the above having been said, working with fur was a nightmare. I tried to follow the advice of more knowledgeable friends, and I still ended up in a veritable snowstorm of hairs. It was a pain. The frustration of how the fur cut, moved, stitched, and many other bad behaviors has thoroughly turned me off of using it ever again. Setting aside every other objection, what a pain of a material. The inner stuffing was a combination of the aforementioned fur scraps and the polyester batting from an old duvet which I was cutting in half for use in a different project. The lining was a small rectangle of shot silk taffeta. And to add a delightful modern twist to this item, I transplanted the pocket from the original stole for use as an inner smartphone pocket. I bet you're thinking, boy, Liz, you've shown us a lot of sewing footage. When are we going to see those items in use, in some kind of cinematic reveal footage? Psych, not until the next video. We still have 5 more winter garments to sew. Next time, I'll take you on a tour of my collection of mail order catalogs and Franken patterning. We'll see the full look at the end. Until next time, Make sure to support me at the ko-fi.com link below and subscribe to see more videos. See you soon!